Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Evil Under the Sun from 1982. Now, I promise this is the last Agatha Christie slash Poirot film for at least for a very long time, possibly ever. But I am glad I went back and rewatched this one. Now, if you have been watching all of these and are interested in these films, you've heard my overall feelings on various portrayals of Poirot, various movies directed by various directors, and various stories from Christie herself. For the most part, most of these stories are pretty directly adapted, obviously cut down substantially from 200 to 300 page books, but still reasonably accurate as I understand it. And so my continued curiosity brought me back to this one. This is the third of the third and not last, but we bookended Peter Ustinov's run as Poirot, starting with Death on the Nile in 78 and then ending with Appointment with Death in 88. In between, he made this one and also a bunch of made-for-TV movies. And I almost skipped this one, first because I didn't really know about it. It seems to be possibly the least known of at least the cinematic releases. But more so than that, I'm happy I didn't miss it because it might be the best adaptation we've watched. And yes, I am going to put it in contention with Murder on the Orient Express. Is it as good a movie as Murder on the Orient Express? No, it's not. But it is approaching. And it is a lot better than Appointment with Death or Death on the Nile. It is the one where I think Ustinov approaches Poirot as the closest to the version of Poirot that I prefer and like. He's still the Ustinov Poirot where he is a little bit too friendly and a little bit not weird enough, but he is just odd enough and has just enough quirky behaviors, and you get just enough of a peek behind the curtain of the weird man that I can appreciate more than any of the other of Ustinov's performances. That his Poirot is decent in its own right. Now, it's still not David Suchet, and it's still not Albert Finney, and I've got my ups and downs with Albert Finney, but I still think I probably prefer him. However, if you're going to make an jolly, amiable Poirot, this is the best portrayal. Interestingly, there's a lot of returning actors to this film. I actually didn't realize until at least one of them until after the fact. Jane Birkin, who plays a major role in this film, plays a much more minor role in Death on the Nile. And it's not that she's got a very recognizable face, but it sort of didn't click for me when watching Death on the Nile that was the case, especially because she plays a more minor role. But she is excellent in this film in a much more major role. I think she fits in with a whole bunch of other more veteran actors really, really well. We also see the return of Maggie Smith. Weirdly, both of them having roles in in Death on the Nile and coming to play completely different roles here. Maybe, I mean, it's years apart at this point. It's what, 4 years or something like that. So the likelihood you're going to be like, oh, that person played a different character is probably pretty slim. But it is kind of interesting as a filmmaking thing that it's not even from a different Poirot. It is a different director. But, you know, it's the same Poirot, two of the same actor, or two same actor for Poirot and two of the same actors for other characters. But anyway, I digress. Both of them put on excellent performances. The performances in this film of all of the Ustinov films are probably the best. They suffer less from some of my complaints about writing and portrayals and general character direction than some of the others. I still think they may, they may be weaker than Murder on the Orient Express, but not dramatically so. I think the characters that we see in this film are much more believable, much more well-rounded, much more subtle and less sort of like over the top. And while Christie always has her tropes, her stock characters, I think this film and the way it's directed leans less on that, certainly than either of the other two Ustinov performances. It is a dramatically better portrayal across the board for all of the various characters. They even have a child character who I don't hate, which, as we've talked about before, I mean, she's a little older. She's like young teens, but still easy to make me hate that sort of thing. And I think she plays the role great. I actually don't know who that actor is, but she's genuinely probably in her teens there, and she does it really well. So the performances across the board, I think, are much, much better. As far as the setting, the cinematography, and all that goes, it is obviously not as much of a spectacle as Death on the Nile, as I talked about in that film. That one really focuses in the early parts, especially on let's really, make the most of our budget to go out and see these places and give a sense of the spectacle and the richness. Well, honestly, the richness of the people doing, imperialist vacationing in a historically significant location. And this does not rely on that. However, as far as getting, I think this is a much better portrayal, because while that's sort of impressive in its own right, just to see the pyramids and all these other places, this is a much more tightly woven location. It is very self-contained, almost better than Murder on the Orient Express, which of course is contained to the train and, by extension, the countryside around it. But this is very much tightly tied to its location. The manner of how the crime is discovered and who's there and why and all these things are directly tied to the location and the layout of the place. And I think that's incredibly important, not only to having a believable setting, but especially in a mystery or drama scenario, being able to contain the parameters. And so when you're trying to, as a viewer, sort of sort out the mystery, being able to have accurate knowledge of who, what, when, where, why. Often the where is sort of sabotaged by the limitations of cinema, where showing you every place and every person would take too much time, so they hand wave it. Here it's very well constructed and very well portrayed. I mean, obviously you can write it to be on an island, but then to actually also portray it in a way where the island is believable and you feel like you have an adequate understanding as a viewer, and that you're not going to have things sprung on you as a surprise, is super important and done better than possibly any of them, possibly including Murder on the Orient Express. To that similar note, I feel like this also is possibly the best, again, possibly including Murder on the Orient Express, of all the films, of giving you the information necessary to come as close as possible to solving things yourself, without either having it handed to you or having it be surprised upon you at the end, when Poirot pulls something out of his hat to say, "Oh, this thing I discovered that you never saw." There's some great storytelling. Again, this has a structural thing of the first half is very much about learning the people and the location and what happens, and then the crime happens, and then what follows is the exploration and the denouement. And so where previously, especially for the other two Ustinov performances, I complained about the first halves being very weak, both in the writing and in general. I hesitate to say purposelessness, but to some extent purposelessness of the first halves, because they didn't tell you all that much. All of it was more setting these tropes forth than actually giving you meaningful information. Whereas pretty much every single scene in this film is in some way pertinent to your understanding of the film itself, or the crime, or the investigation that'll follow. There's even something that I really congratulate for its subtlety, which is there's a portion towards the end of the film where Poirot does his investigation, and it is essentially a montage of the investigation, and it's subtle enough to not show you exactly what he's doing, but to hint at you a whole bunch of information. And if you haven't already at that point gotten an idea of, I think it's this, there's some of this here, this is suspicious, those sorts of things. If you're not already there, it's sort of a final offering by the film to say, look at what Poirot is looking at. We're not telling you what any of it is, but here's sort of the circles and arrows to say, it's over here somewhere, try and figure it out. And again, with any mystery, it's far more satisfying to feel like you either solved it or came close to solving it. That's part of the appeal of the genre. And for not only the through and through the storytelling, but these also these little cinematic things of showing you, without like explicitly just having a disembodied camera, zoom in on an element, which is a very bad cinematic thing that I think I may have talked about. It does happen in some of the other films, of just like, hey, the camera's going to look at this thing that nobody else noticed in the world, but you did because you're the camera and you're omniscient. But I digress. The storytelling is much more well knitted together, that the elements of the acting and the writing and the storytelling and the pacing as well all serve to help the viewer feel empowered to solve the mystery and be alongside Poirot. I almost have to go back and watch Murder on the Orient Express again to see how I feel about it now, reflecting on these other films. I definitely think it's still close. It might still be the best one, but I think this one, having watched it about half an hour ago, does genuinely give it a run for its money. And while there's certain like charming polish to Murder on the Orient Express, and there's certain elements of it, including Poirot's portrayal, that I do prefer, I think this might be less of a trying to I don't like saying one movie is better than another in the same way I don't like rating movies with numerical values. Every movie is a different movie from another movie. The only thing I think you can ever really exactly say this is the better one might be in some cases where there is multiple cuts of a film, and you can say this is the better cut, or this is the better edit, or the reintroduction of these elements to the film makes it better. And so I hesitate to compare what is ultimately kind of apples and oranges between Evil Under the Sun and Murder on the Orient Express. They're both good in their own rights. And again, I'm still kind of stunned that this one is in the Ustinov canon. Usually with these sorts of things, especially repeated adaptations of novels in a series or something like that, or a repeated character, usually the early ones are the best ones, because when you're trying to make a film adaptation, you usually pick either the first or the best, because it is the most likely to hook new viewership onto it. I actually don't know where this one falls in the canon. I believe in the book canon, this one is some years after Appointment with Death. And so it is kind of funny that I ended up watching it in the order that I did. And overall, I'm just pretty pleased with it. I feel like the elements of the story that are necessary to get the mystery across are just more convincing than they possibly are even in Murder on the Orient Express. And while there's some contrivance, I mean, of course, it's a mystery novel written in the 30s or 40s. You know, there's certain elements of this and even modern mystery novels that are just sort of naturally absurd. We're gonna, make this a little bit silly and a little bit calculated. And if you really pick at this, it had to be a little bit too perfect for reality in order for this to happen the way it did. Sure, there's some problems, but it doesn't. My how I feel about it is kind of messy, because I still feel like Murder on the Orient Express is probably a better spectacle. It's more engaging and more dramatic than this one is. I don't think that's arguable. But as far as like a sort of more low-key portrayal of the story that doesn't delve as deeply into that sort of cinematic over-dramatization, for better or for worse, this is really solid. It if it had been an episode of the David Suchet show, I mean, again, apples and oranges, but I feel like it fits in pretty well. It's not really overblown, but it's just tight and well tied together and well acted. And I'm just pretty pleased with it. I think there are some elements that are weaker even than, certainly than Murder on the Orient Express, but some of the other Suchet performances as well. I don't think the music or the scoring in general is or the like audio editing in general is super tight on this film. And I think the costumes they don't, the costumes don't wow me the way I want them to. So some of them are fun. There are some fun elements in some of the costuming, but it's not quite the level of splashy and silly that I want. And so I do think even Death on the Nile does beat it in some respects in that way, but some of that is just down to the setting. A foreign vacation is very different than a seaside resort, and so I just wanted a little bit more from that aspect. Likewise, I think, I'm not wowed by any of the cinematography in this film, but I think it's very consistent through and through. And so, for anyone who is a Poirot fan, I would definitely recommend this one over any of the other any of the other Ustinov performances. And if you like, or if you've already watched Murder on the Orient Express, I'd encourage you to watch this one as a comparison. I thought this one was going to be hard to get my hands on, but actually it turns out it's on a bunch of streaming services. I just assumed that because I had not heard of it or stumbled into it at any point. So anyway, yeah, I kind of pleased to cap it out with this one. After Appointment with Death, I was really worried that the sequel one that was older, seeing it was 6 more years before Appointment with Death, I thought this had a good possibility of being the weakest of the contributions, and instead it's the strongest. And so I'm pretty pleased with that. So if it's your cup of tea, then give it a shot. If you've seen Murder on the Orient Express and you like it, I definitely encourage you to watch this one. So anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.